Why was she always the first one to arrive, even when she had been working until 3 in the morning? The sterile lights of the secure facility hummed overhead, reflecting off polished steel and glass. Sergeant Eva Rose Stova sat alone at the console, her posture precise, her expression unreadable. The building still smelled faintly of disinfectant and static electricity, as though the machines themselves exhaled a cold breath across the room. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the low hum of servers vibrating behind armored walls. She had been told this installation was a work center, but she knew better. This was a battlefield, just one made of code instead of bullets, one where hesitation was just as fatal. She adjusted her headset, her eyes narrowing against the lines of code scrolling across the holographic display. To anyone else it looked like gibberish, endless data streams cascading in green and white. But to her it was language, alive, pulsing, whispering problems and possibilities in the rhythm of its movement. She saw patterns others couldn't. She always had. And yet no one really saw her. When the others arrived for the morning shift, they barely acknowledged her presence. She was the quiet sergeant in the corner, the one with the hair pulled back too tightly, the one who never raised her voice, never laughed at their jokes, never fought for attention. To most of them, she was just another technician assigned to a unit nobody had heard of, a transfer with a redacted service history. Plain, forgettable, disposable. But she knew what was coming. She felt it the way a pilot feels turbulence before the instruments register it. Something was building inside Chimera, the sprawling unmanned systems command and control network she had been working on for years. The code had begun to twitch in ways that unsettled her. She had tried to warn her section chief. He waved her off with the same dismissive chuckle he always used when she spoke. "Not your lane, Sergeant. Stick to your console." Her lane, as if she hadn't written most of the foundational architecture herself, as if she hadn't bled into this project in ways no one would ever understand. She was used to the silence, the dismissal, the way they pushed her into the background. But she also knew silence was a weapon, one they underestimated until it cut deeper than any scream. The heavy door swung open and the shift lead arrived. Staff Sergeant Dale Cobb. His voice entered before he did. "You're not even cleared to touch that console, little girl. Go fetch the coffee." The words dripped with condescension, loud enough for the entire gallery of junior technicians to hear. Chuckles rose from the room, nervous and half-hearted but still cutting. He thrived on that reaction, validation by humiliation. His shadow fell over her, a large man looming, flexing his presence like it was a weapon. To him, rank was measured in volume, and intimidation was leadership. Eva did not look up. Her fingers glided across the display, delicate, precise, like a surgeon refusing to be distracted in the middle of an operation. Her silence only enraged him further. To Cobb, quiet was weakness. To Eva, quiet was survival. But outside the glass, far away in a soundproofed observation room, someone else was watching. General Marcus Thorne leaned forward, his jaw hardening as he studied her posture, her focus, the surgical economy of her hands. He didn't see a subordinate lost in a maze of code. He saw a master shaping the system like an artist with clay. He had seen competence in many forms during his career, but this was something rarer, something that couldn't be faked. He also saw Cobb, and the anger rose in him like a tide. But Eva didn't need anyone's rescue. She had already made her decision. She wasn't going to fight for validation. She was going to let her actions speak, louder than any insult ever could. The alarm started quietly, a soft chime, then a sharp red strobe. Suddenly, the room came alive in chaos. Warning sirens blared as cascading failures ripped through Chimera's primary targeting matrix. Screens turned crimson with error messages. The most advanced weapons system in the world was suddenly blind. Cobb did what he always did, he shouted. "Check your diagnostics. Johnson, reroute power. Ramirez, find the fault now." Contradictory orders spilled from him like a broken faucet, each one louder than the last. His boots slammed against the tile floor as he stalked from console to console, projecting authority he didn't have. His voice grew hoarse with panic. His words were meaningless noise. And in that storm, Eva moved. Not hurried, not flustered, just certain. She rose from her station and walked to the master command console, the heart of Chimera, without a word. Every eye in the room followed her, though no one dared speak. She laid her hands on the interface and the storm began to quiet. Her fingers danced across the holographic screen faster than anyone could follow. It was not improvisation. It was not luck. It was knowledge so deep it looked like instinct. Line by line, she dissected the problem, bypassed corrupted protocols, rewrote segments of code on the fly. The alarms softened. The errors slowed. Partition by partition, the system began to stabilize. It was like watching someone heal a machine, coaxing it back to life. The gallery of technicians stood frozen, mesmerized. They were watching history unfold, a single woman single-handedly averting a catastrophic failure. For the first time, they realized she was not one of them. She was something else entirely. And for Cobb, that realization was unbearable. Her competence was not just a solution. It was a mirror held to his face, reflecting his ignorance for the entire room to see. Every keystroke she made stripped away his authority, his bluster, his fragile ego, and he could not stand it. "You hear me?" he growled, stepping close, his voice low, dangerous. "I gave you an order, Sergeant. You don't ignore me." She raised a single hand, not to him, but to the room, the universal gesture for one moment. Then she executed the final command. The main screen turned green. System stability, 100%. Matrix online. The room exhaled as one. They had been seconds from disaster. She had saved them all. And it was then, in the moment of her triumph, that Cobb shattered. Blinded by rage, stripped of his authority, exposed before his peers, he lashed out in the only way left to him. He struck her. The open palm cracked against the side of her head, sharp and humiliating. Her classified headset spun to the ground, shattering against the steel floor. The silence that followed was louder than the sirens had been. No one moved, no one breathed. Assaulting a fellow NCO was unthinkable, unforgivable. They all knew the line that had been crossed, but what stunned them more was Eva's reaction. She did not cry out. She did not flinch. She did not even look at him. She bent down, picked up the broken headset and set it gently on the console. Then she turned her head not to Cobb but to the security camera glowing on the far wall. For the first time, its red light blinked on. In a distant bunker, General Thorne's eyes narrowed. He had seen everything, and when her gaze met that camera, he understood. She wasn't asking for help. She was confirming readiness. She was giving him a signal. His finger pressed a button that had never been pressed before. Across the entire installation, a piercing siren sounded. It wasn't a drill. It wasn't an attack alarm. It was something no one recognized, a sound that vibrated in their bones, a sound reserved for only one event. Directive Alpha. Steel blast doors slammed shut across the base. Every communication line went dark. Every screen turned black, replaced by the same words in red. Directive Alpha. Cease all operations. Shelter in place. This is not a drill. The technicians panicked, glancing at each other in fear. Only one question filled their minds. What could possibly be so important that a single strike to one woman had triggered the highest security protocol in existence? And slowly, realization dawned. It wasn't the system. It wasn't the failure. It was her. What kind of soldier summoned a siren no one had ever heard before? The wail cut through the walls, vibrating inside rib cages, freezing every technician where they stood. Panic spread in whispers, then in gasps. Directive Alpha. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It wasn't some buried training manual protocol whispered about in tech school. It was real. and it was happening here, right now. Blast doors sealed the corridors. Steel slammed against steel with the finality of a tomb. Communications blacked out across the entire base. Every screen blinked to black, then pulsed with the red letters no one could mistake. Cease all operations. Shelter in place. This is not a drill. In the control room of Project Chimera, eyes darted like prey animals trapped in a cage. The young technicians looked at one another with pale faces, their confidence gone, their voices reduced to trembling questions. What does it mean? Why here, why now? Is this war? Only one man seemed unaffected, Cobb, but even his bravado faltered as the silence stretched. His chest rose and fell too quickly, his jaw working. He opened his mouth to bark another order, but the words didn't come. For the first time, he wasn't sure if anyone would obey. Eva sat perfectly still at the console. Her hand rested lightly against the surface, fingertips hovering above the keys as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Her eyes were steady, her breathing calm. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look confused. She looked ready. Then came the footsteps. A thunder of boots pounding in unison outside the sealed doors. The air shifted, heavy with something far more disciplined than panic. When the blast doors groaned and tore open, the technicians gasped as a wall of black-clad figures poured in. They weren't base security. They weren't MPs. They were something else entirely. Their armor was matte black, featureless, designed to absorb light. Their rifles were angled low but controlled with a precision that radiated menace. Their faces were hidden behind blast visors. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They didn't acknowledge anyone in the room. They moved as one organism, each step measured, each gesture synchronized. And within seconds they formed a circle, a perfect, protective wall around Eva's console. Their weapons faced outward at everyone else. The technicians shrank back. Even the captain in charge stammered, his voice breaking as he tried to assert authority. What is the meaning of this? This is my control room. But his words withered in the silence. The soldiers did not respond. They didn't even turn their helmets toward him. It became clear in that moment, this wasn't his room. It had never been. All focus, all protection, all authority belonged to the small, silent woman seated inside that circle. Cobb staggered a step back, his skin pale, his lips trembling. He wasn't being ignored because they hadn't seen him. He was being ignored because he didn't matter. His mind clawed for explanations, for some way this could still be about him, about his authority, but the truth pressed down on him with suffocating weight. It wasn't about him. It had never been about him. And then the sound changed. A new rhythm, polished leather against concrete, slow, deliberate. Each step rang like a countdown, each echo heavier than the last. The doorway filled with three figures. Gasps rippled through the room. Even the most junior airmen recognized the uniforms, the stars gleaming on shoulders that carried the weight of entire wars. On the left, General Evelyn Reed. Her eyes swept the room like a blade, sharp, analytical, missing nothing. Her reputation preceded her, the iron mind behind U.S. Cyber Command. On the right, General Javier Moores. A legend whispered about in classified briefings, the ghost who had commanded shadows and fire across continents. His presence alone was enough to silence rooms. And in the center, taller than both, his face carved in granite, was General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. The room seemed to shrink around them. Reality itself bent. This wasn't supposed to happen. Generals didn't travel in trios. They didn't descend into server rooms on remote drone bases. They didn't respond to personnel disputes. But here they were. And they weren't here for Cobb. Every technician, every officer, every civilian felt their breath catch as the three generals strode directly through the armored cordon, not pausing, not glancing at anyone else. Their focus was absolute. They stopped in front of Eva's console. General Thorne leaned down, his voice low, calm, edged with something like reverence. "Sergeant Rostova, report. Are you physically compromised?" The room froze again. Cobb's knees nearly buckled. That wasn't the voice of a commander addressing an enlisted subordinate. That was the voice of a man addressing something far rarer. Eva finally turned her head. Her gaze lifted to meet his, calm, unwavering. "Negative, sir," she said evenly. "Minor impact to the left cranial region. No concussion, no disorientation. Communications headset non-functional." The generals exchanged the barest of glances, a flicker of calculation passing between them. "System status," General Reed's voice cut in, precise, demanding. Eva's posture straightened, her voice shifting into a cadence that was all business. "Chimera is stable, General. Cascade triggered by a flawed subroutine in the latest patch. I've isolated and rewritten corrupted code. The system is secure." Silence followed, not disbelief, not doubt, respect. Three generals, each commanding armies and fleets, stood listening like students to a teacher. The inversion was staggering. For the first time, every technician in the room began to grasp the truth. The quiet woman they had dismissed, the one they had laughed at, ordered around, humiliated, was not just another sergeant. She wasn't even just a specialist. She was the reason the system existed at all. Cobb swayed on his feet, his breath ragged. His face was ghost-white. His body screamed to move, to run, but he was trapped, nailed to the floor by the weight of what he was seeing. He had mocked her. He had struck her. He had put his hand on someone who commanded a response so profound it bent the entire chain of command. The general straightened. For the first time, General Thorne turned his gaze on someone other than Eva, his eyes locked on Cobb. The silence became suffocating. "Staff Sergeant," Thorne said finally, his voice calm, dangerous in its quiet, "do you have any idea what you've just done?" Cobb's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His chest hitched. His hands trembled. He shook his head once, twice, a pathetic, jerky movement. Thorne's lips pressed into a thin line. He gestured to a trembling technician at a side console. "Service file 90 Delta Alpha Rostova, full clearance. Authorization Thorne, Omega 1. The tech's fingers shook against the keys. None of them had ever heard of an Omega-level clearance. When the file appeared on the central screen, gasps spread again. Most of the text was blacked out, entire pages lost behind redaction boxes. But what remained visible was enough. Awards stacked in a column that seemed impossible for one lifetime. The Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the CIA's Intelligence Star, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded in a classified ceremony. And then a line unredacted, a line that shattered everything they thought they knew. Chief Architect and Lead Developer, Project Chimera. The technicians staggered. Some put hands over their mouths. The captain looked like he might collapse. And Cobb nearly choked on air. His lungs refused to work. His eyes bulged, his chest heaving, as if his own body was rejecting the truth. The coffee girl he had struck was not a technician, not a transfer, not an invisible shadow in his section. She was the system, the mind that had built the most advanced defense network in the world from scratch. General Thorne's voice cracked the silence like a hammer. "You didn't just assault an NCO. You assaulted a national strategic asset. You attempted to sever the living link between this facility and the National Command Authority. That headset you broke wasn't worth more than your car. The woman you touched is worth more than the system itself." His words dropped like stones, each one heavier than the last. And then, in a moment that defied all military tradition, General Thorne straightened, turned back to Eva, and raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, voice carrying through the stunned chamber, "on behalf of a grateful nation, we thank you for your service." General Reed followed, Then General Moore's, 3 four-star generals saluting a sergeant. The technicians didn't breathe. Cobb's vision blurred. The world spun. Everything he thought he knew about power, rank, authority, all of it crumbled into dust. And Eva simply nodded, calm, steady, unshaken. She didn't need their validation. She already knew who she was. How do you erase a man's entire existence in less than a day? The answer came quietly, without ceremony, without announcement. 1 hour after the 3 generals left the control room, Staff Sergeant Dale Cobb was gone. Not gone in the way most men leave the service, reassignment, paperwork, a farewell barbecue on the flight line. Gone in a way that terrified everyone who had ever known him. His workstation was empty before the lockdown lifted. His personnel file vanished from the base servers. His name scrubbed from the duty roster. His security clearance revoked. His digital footprint erased. It was as if he had never served, as if he had never existed. He wasn't transferred, he wasn't disciplined, he was deleted. The technicians whispered behind sealed doors, each trying to reconcile what they had seen. Some swore they heard him pleading as black-suited agents escorted him away. Others claimed he walked silently, dazed, already broken. No one knew for sure, but everyone agreed on one thing: he was never coming back. And his absence was louder than his presence had ever been. The workstation he once claimed as his throne remained untouched. No new technician sat there. No new login appeared on the console. The empty seat became a shrine, a reminder carved into steel and silence. They called it Cobb's Corner, and whenever new airmen arrived, the veterans pointed to that chair and told the story. Not the story of a sergeant who was too loud, too arrogant, too reckless, but the story of the woman he struck. Directive Alpha held for 72 hours, 3 days in which every soul on the base was locked down, interrogated, debriefed, and made to sign secrecy oaths so severe the very color of the control room walls was now classified. The agents who questioned them were calm, polite, and merciless. Nothing was left unasked. Every technician, every officer, every civilian was reminded in chilling detail. What they had witnessed was not for retelling, not to family, not to friends, not even to each other. But oaths cannot contain legends. Whispers slipped through cracks in the silence. Late at night, in barracks rooms thick with cigarette smoke, the story was retold in fragments. In the gym, in the chow hall, in the maintenance bays, eyes darted before words were spoken, voices lowered to near whispers. It wasn't gossip anymore. It was scripture. They didn't call it the day Cobb disappeared. They called it the day of the 3 stars, or more reverently still, Rostova's stand. Every version carried the same core: the strike, the silence, the red light on the camera, the impossible response. Soldiers who had spent their careers believing rank was the measure of respect suddenly saw something else, a truth stripped bare. Loudness wasn't leadership, presence wasn't power, competence was. That realization rippled through the base like an earthquake. Shouting, once seen as authority, now smelled of insecurity. The loudest NCOs found their voices no longer commanded attention, only suspicion. It was the quiet ones, the focused ones, the unassuming ones who now drew respect. They called it the Rostova rule. Never underestimate the quiet. Eva herself vanished as completely as Cobb, not in disgrace but in protection. Within hours of the incident, the 3 generals had ordered her transferred to a secure location. Few even saw her leave. One moment she was there, still and unshaken within the circle of black-clad guardians. The next, she was gone, transported under armed escort to a facility whose coordinates were whispered about but never confirmed. And yet her presence remained. Old personnel photos, grainy, color-drained headshots from forgotten files began to circulate. Some ended up pinned discreetly to bulletin boards, taped inside lockers, tucked into binders. In each she looked the same, unsmiling, hair pulled back, eyes steady. Not the image of a hero in dramatic pose, but the image of someone who carried storms inside her and never needed to show them. She became myth, a reminder carved into the culture of the base. Cobb had been erased, but Eva had been immortalized. 2 weeks later, in a fluorescent-lit classroom at the base's NCO Academy, an instructor paused mid-lecture. A room full of young sergeants looked on as he tapped the corner of his desk with a single finger. "Cobb's Corner," he said quietly. "You all know what that means." A murmur rippled through the students. Heads nodded. One or two glanced nervously at the empty seat in the back of the classroom, a seat that no one dared use. "It means you never know who you're talking to," the instructor continued, his tone solemn. "Do your job, show respect. Don't mistake silence for weakness. Don't confuse loudness for strength. That lesson cost a man his career, his honor, and maybe more. Don't be him." The room was silent. The story had already become mandatory curriculum, not in official manuals, but in the living memory of every soldier who wanted to survive the culture of this place. The Rostova rule was no longer a whisper, it was doctrine. Meanwhile, far from the base, Eva worked in shadows. The new facility was colder, deeper, carved into stone and steel below the earth. It had no windows, no sunlight. Time blurred there, marked only by the rhythms of machines and the constant hum of servers. She preferred it that way. Quiet was her refuge, and in this place, quiet reigned. Most never saw her. The few who did spoke of her presence in hushed tones. She was different up close, they said, not intimidating, not unkind, but unshakably focused. A mind always half in the code, half in the world no one else could see. And yet sometimes she would pause. One evening, a young airman named Keller sat slumped at his console, his face in his hands. He had spent 3 days trying to debug a line of code that refused to bend. Frustration radiated from him, sharp and bitter. He didn't even notice when Eva stopped behind him. Without a word, she leaned forward. Her finger traced a single line on his screen. Tap, 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 3 quick keystrokes. The error revealed itself, logic unraveling, the solution so clean it made him gasp. He turned to thank her, but she was already walking away, her steps light, her posture straight. She gave only the smallest nod before disappearing into the shadows of the server room. Keller stared at the screen, stunned, not just by the fix but by the lesson. She hadn't explained, she hadn't lectured, she hadn't even claimed credit, she had simply acted. Her actions were her voice, her competence was her creed. And he would never forget it. On the old base, where the story first sparked, life adjusted to the new doctrine. The culture shifted in ways small but undeniable. Sergeants who once barked orders began asking questions. Officers who had ignored junior airmen started to listen, realizing the quiet ones might hold the answers they couldn't see. Shouting was no longer respected, it was pitied. Confidence was no longer measured in decibels but in results. The ripple was subtle but irreversible. Cobb had been the warning, Eva was the standard. And in the quiet corners of barracks rooms, soldiers repeated the story not to glorify her, but to remind each other of a truth too often forgotten. Competence doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. It simply acts. 1 year later, a geopolitical crisis cracked open across the world. 2 rival nations armed to the teeth stared each other down across contested waters. An American carrier group stood in the middle, the USS Abraham Lincoln locked in a deadly standoff. An enemy destroyer armed its missile systems. Target locks screamed across the radar. Rules of engagement were clear. Any verified lock meant overwhelming retaliation. The world was seconds away from war. In the White House Situation Room, the president leaned forward, voice tight. "Do we have confirmation?" "Yes, sir," an aide replied, her voice trembling. "Target lock confirmed. Missiles are armed." General Thorne stood behind the president, silent, grim. The order to fire hovered in the air, heavy, inevitable. His hand twitched toward the phone. And then the impossible. Every fire control radar aboard the enemy destroyer blinked offline. Missile guidance froze. Weapon systems went dark, useless. The destroyer was blind, deaf, powerless. The enemy captain panicked, ordered his ship to withdraw. The crisis evaporated in seconds. On the news, it was called a systems malfunction, a freak glitch. But in the Situation Room, General Thorne knew better. He turned to a secure console. A single line of text appeared. CYMRA protocol engaged, threat neutralized, system is stable. The signature beneath it was simple, unmistakable. Eva Rostova. Thorne exhaled, the weight of catastrophe sliding off his shoulders. He typed the only reply that mattered. "Thank you." Her answer came moments later, 2 words that captured her life, her creed, her legacy. Acknowledged. What happens when a single day becomes mandatory history? At Maxwell Air Force Base, months after the incident, a new class of officers filed into a lecture hall. They were eager, sharp, still intoxicated with the pride of wearing gold bars on their collars. They thought they were ready to learn the art of leadership. The lights dimmed. A projection flared on the wall. It wasn't a war map, a tactical diagram, or a list of chain-of-command regulations. It was a single phrase in stark letters. Directive Alpha, the day of the 3 stars. The instructor, a colonel with salt at his temples, stepped forward. His voice carried not authority but gravity. "Every one of you will hear about this. Every one of you will carry it. This is not a story about tactics. It's not about firepower, it's about respect." The room stilled. The story spilled out, carefully redacted, names stripped away except for one: Sergeant Eva Rostova. The colonel described the strike, the silence, the red light on the camera, the 3 generals entering the room, saluting a sergeant. He told it slowly, deliberately, his voice sinking deeper into the minds of the officers in training. Do not mistake quiet for weakness. Do not mistake loudness for strength. Never forget that the most important person in the room may be the one you notice the least. The cadets scribbled notes, though none were required. They knew instinctively this was not a lecture to pass a test. It was a lesson meant to follow them for the rest of their careers. For the first time in modern memory, an unwritten rule became institutional doctrine: the Rostova Rule. Back in the subterranean facility, Eva was unaware her story was spreading like wildfire through classrooms, barracks, and mess halls across the world. Or if she knew, she didn't care. Her focus was work, always the work. The room she lived in was silent but alive, humming servers, endless code, screens glowing with data streams only she could fully understand. Her days blurred into nights. Sleep was secondary. Food was perfunctory. The system never rested, so neither did she. And yet in that silence, something hollow echoed inside her. She never wanted legend. She never wanted generals saluting her. She wanted simplicity, to solve problems, to build things that worked, to use her mind in ways that felt like breathing. But now, everything she touched carried weight she hadn't chosen. Every keystroke rippled across governments, across lives. Sometimes she thought of her father, a machinist in a small town, hands scarred from years of metal and oil. He once told her, "Dignity doesn't shout, Eva. It doesn't push. It just works. And when you do something right, it speaks for itself." She had lived by that, but what he never told her was how lonely dignity could be. Because dignity does not demand attention, and sometimes that meant no one saw the cost. A month later, a storm broke over Washington. Not a storm of weather, but of politics. A senator leaked fragments of the incident to the press. Not names, not details, just the fact that a classified program had been nearly compromised by an assault within its own walls. Reporters spun it into questions about toxic command climates, about hidden geniuses buried in the ranks, about who really carried the weight of national security. They never spoke her name. They couldn't. but the outline of her story became public. Eva ignored it. She didn't own a television. She barely glanced at headlines. The noise of the world couldn't reach her in her subterranean silence, but the men above her, generals, politicians, leaders, felt the tremors. Some wanted to parade her as proof of innovation. Others wanted to bury the story deeper, to make sure no one outside classified channels ever whispered her name. The debate raged in secure chambers. She never attended. She never asked. She didn't care for what others wanted from her. She only cared for the code, the system, the work that kept millions alive. But her isolation weighed on her team. One evening, Keller, the young airman she had once silently helped, knocked lightly on the steel doorframe of her workspace. He hesitated, clutching a notebook, his voice uncertain. "Sergeant, do you ever," he faltered, "do you ever feel like all this swallows you, like there's nothing left outside the screen?" She turned slowly, eyes resting on him. For a long moment she said nothing. Keller shifted nervously, ready to apologize, to retreat. Then softly she answered, "Yes." The word hung heavy, honest, startling. Keller blinked. He hadn't expected an answer at all. Eva's gaze softened, the smallest shift, almost imperceptible. "But then I remember, if the work is heavy, it's because it matters. If it feels endless, it's because the world needs it to be." She gestured to his notebook. "Show me." He handed it over, hands trembling. She flipped it open, scanning his code sketches. Her brow furrowed, not in frustration but in focus. Then, without a word, she picked up his pen and corrected a sequence. She tapped the page twice, set it down, and handed it back. He nodded, eyes wide, his throat too tight to speak. She had given him more than a fix. She had given him reassurance, the kind that didn't need speeches or encouragements. Sometimes one word was enough. On the old base where it all began, Cobb's Corner became ritual. Every fresh recruit was shown the empty seat on their first day. They were told the story in hushed tones, ending always with the same line: "Respect the quiet ones, because you never know who you're talking to." It became superstition. Some said sitting in the chair cursed your career. Others said the chair was left empty as tribute. No one touched it, not even commanders. And slowly the base itself changed. Noise gave way to listening. Rank gave way to merit. Conversations shifted. Meetings grew shorter but sharper. People began noticing the airman who stayed behind after hours, the sergeant who didn't speak much but always delivered. Loudness became a mask, one fewer dared to wear. The culture turned. The Rostova rule had teeth. Meanwhile, beyond the reach of doctrine, Eva faced her own test. A new crisis brewed, this time in digital shadows. A foreign adversary had built its own autonomous system, crude but dangerous. Its architecture mirrored Chimera's early design. Someone, somewhere, had stolen fragments of her work. The copy was unstable, reckless, a weapon pointed at its own operators as much as at its enemies. If unleashed, it could blind satellites, cripple fleets, crash economies. The generals came to her with the problem, voices grim. They didn't issue orders, they asked, "Can you stop it?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." For 3 days she vanished into the system. She barely ate, barely slept. Her fingers blurred, her eyes burned. Every line of code she dismantled was a memory of the years she had spent perfecting Chimera, the discipline, the pain, the silent victories. She faced an echo of herself, a distorted reflection built without care, without respect. And in dismantling it, she felt something like sorrow, a reminder that her genius, even stolen, could be turned toward destruction. But on the 4th day, the adversary's system collapsed, its networks locked, its servers fried, its stolen code bricked into silence. The generals exhaled. War was delayed again. Eva said nothing. She simply set her broken headset on the console beside her, the same one from that day, and returned to work. Far away, cadets at West Point studied the Day of the Three Stars as a case study in humility. Navy midshipmen at Annapolis read it as an ethics lesson. Even civilian universities dissected it in lectures on organizational leadership. It was no longer rumor, it was no longer myth, it was canon. And Eva Rose Stova, still unseen, still unassuming, carried on in silence. She didn't hear the lectures, she didn't see the reverence, she didn't need to. Her legacy wasn't in the stories told about her. It was in the culture she had changed without saying a word. How close can the world come to destruction before anyone notices the quiet hand that pulls it back? The standoff began in the Strait. Two rival nations, both armed to the teeth, both with leaders hungry for pride, circled one another in waters too narrow to contain them. Warships bristling with missiles and guns prowled back and forth, each movement mirrored by the other. And in the middle, caught like a thread stretched too tight, was the USS Abraham Lincoln and her strike group. American sailors stood at their stations, eyes glued to radar, hands hovering near triggers. Every man and woman aboard knew what a misstep meant. The world had seen close calls before. This one was worse. At 200 hours, an enemy destroyer locked its missile systems onto the Lincoln. Targeting alarms screamed across the carrier's decks. Rules of engagement left no ambiguity. If a hostile vessel achieved verified lock, the carrier group had the right to retaliate with overwhelming force. The order was a heartbeat away. In Washington, the Situation Room fell into a suffocating silence. The president leaned forward, voice tight. "Are we certain?" "Yes, sir," came the answer. "Target lock confirmed." General Marcus Thorne stood behind the president, jaw hard, hand inches from the line that would send a carrier's arsenal into the sea. His eyes were grim, but deep down he waited for something else, something quieter. And then it came. On the radar screens, the enemy's systems blinked out. Fire control radars died. Guidance networks went dark. The destroyer, moments from launching, was suddenly blind, deaf, helpless. Confusion rippled through the enemy fleet. Orders shouted over open channels turned to chaos. The destroyer backed off. The crisis dissolved like smoke in wind. On the news the next morning, reporters called it a systems malfunction, a glitch. Engineers spoke of humidity, faulty circuits, random chance. But Thorne knew better. He turned to his secure console. A single message appeared, routed through layers of encryption no outsider would ever breach. CYMRA protocol engaged, threat neutralized, system is stable. At the bottom, a single name. Eva Rostova. Thorne's chest loosened, his throat caught. He typed the only words that felt sufficient. "Thank you." The reply came minutes later. "Acknowledged." In her subterranean command cell, Eva leaned back from the console. The screens bathed her face in pale light. Her eyes were dry, her lips pressed tight. She stared at the broken headset beside her, the same one she had placed down that day in Chimera's control room, a reminder of what silence could mean. The crisis was over. Millions would never know how close they had come to war. Millions would never know her name. And she didn't want them to. But a hollow ache tugged at her chest. Each time she prevented disaster, the weight of solitude deepened. She carried entire nations on her shoulders, and yet, outside this bunker, she was invisible. Her name erased from rosters, her life unspoken. Was this what her father had meant? That dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. She closed her eyes. The words echoed in her mind, but sometimes silence felt like exile. Far away in lecture halls and training schools, her story spread further. In Annapolis, a Navy ethics professor leaned on his desk as cadets scribbled notes. "Remember the Day of the Three Stars," he said. "Remember what it means. Leadership is not volume. Leadership is competence. Respect the quiet ones. Trust the capable ones. Because one day they might save your life and you may never even know it." In Colorado Springs, Air Force cadets sat straighter in their chairs when the phrase Directive Alpha appeared on the board. They mouthed the words like scripture. Rostova had become more than a sergeant's name. She had become a parable. And in the barracks of the old desert base, Cobb's Corner remained empty. Recruits were shown the seat and told, respect the quiet, because you never know who you're talking to. The legend grew. Eva never heard the words, she never saw the faces, but her shadow stretched longer every day. Then came the night she was tested again. It was late. The hum of servers pulsed around her, steady, alive. Her fingers moved across the console with a rhythm as natural as breathing. She was tracking anomalies in satellite data, subtle, almost imperceptible patterns hidden in noise. But Eva's eyes caught them. She always caught them. She leaned closer. Threads of code pulsed where they shouldn't. Someone else was here. Not inside Chimera, but circling its edges like a predator testing a fence. Probes, infiltration attempts. Small, patient, clever. She tightened her jaw. The code was foreign, not the crude chaos of stolen fragments she had seen before. This was deliberate, focused. Another mind was on the other end of the stream, watching, testing, waiting. And for the first time in years, Eva felt something unfamiliar: resistance. She moved faster, isolating the probes, tracing their origins. Her hands blurred. The system shuddered as the intruder pushed back. She had never faced opposition like this. Whoever it was, they weren't amateurs. For hours, the digital battle raged, silent but violent. Invisible sparks flew between her keystrokes and the intruders. One line of defense fell, another rebuilt. She rerouted, recoded, reinforced. Each move countered with precision. Finally, at dawn, she cornered them. She locked their stream, contained it, and dissected it line by line until it collapsed into silence. The screen cleared. The system was stable. But Eva's chest heaved. Her hands trembled for the first time in years. She wasn't shaken by defeat. She had won, but she understood the truth. Someone out there could stand toe to toe with her. She was no longer the only architect at the table. The generals convened hours later, their faces pale, their voices hushed. "Who was it?" one demanded. Eva sat calm, her posture composed though fatigue shadowed her eyes. Origin obfuscated. Multiple relay chains, but not random. They weren't trying to breach the system. They were testing me, learning me. General Reed leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Learning you." Eva met her gaze. "Yes, whoever they are, they know I exist." The words hit like a gunshot. The room stilled. For years, Eva had been a phantom, a classified myth known only to a handful of leaders. Now, someone outside their walls had glimpsed her through the code. And that meant they wouldn't stop. That night, Eva sat alone in her bunk. The hum of the servers echoed faintly through concrete walls. She stared at the headset on her nightstand, the scarred metal bent from the strike long ago. She thought of the silence that had saved her, the silence that had made her a legend, the silence that now isolated her more than ever. Her father's words whispered again, "Dignity doesn't speak." But a question she had never asked before rose in her mind. What happens when silence is no longer enough? How do you fight an enemy you can't see, one who knows you exist? Eva sat in the command cell, her eyes locked on cascading lines of code. To anyone else, the screen would have looked stable, perfect. But she knew better. The silence in the system was too clean, too deliberate. Whoever had tested her before hadn't gone away. They were waiting, patient, in the shadows of the net. She flexed her hands. Her knuckles ached from hours without pause. She leaned back for a moment, letting her gaze fall to the broken headset on her desk. Its surface caught the pale glow of the screens, a relic of the day her silence had become legend, a reminder of the moment her life had changed. And now, it might be the only tether she had left to who she was before all this. The door opened softly. Airman Keller hesitated in the threshold. His youth showed in the set of his shoulders, The nervous way he held a clipboard like it was a shield. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "the generals want a report." Eva didn't look up. They already know what they need to. Keller lingered, shifting his weight. "They said they want to know if you think it's personal, if they're targeting you." Her fingers stilled on the console. She drew in a slow breath before finally turning her head. Her eyes were calm, but there was no hiding the exhaustion carved into her face. "They're not targeting Chimera anymore," she said softly. "They're targeting me." Keller's throat bobbed. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. But the silence stretched, heavy, and Eva could feel his fear radiating off him. "Go," she said at last. "Get some rest." He nodded quickly and left, closing the door behind him. Alone again, Eva leaned forward, her reflection ghostly in the screen. She whispered to herself, barely audible. "They know." Above ground, her legend spread faster than any virus. At Fort Benning, young soldiers learned about Cobb's Corner during orientation. The instructor pointed to the empty chair set in the corner of the classroom, untouched, unclaimed, left as if waiting for a ghost. "You all know why this chair's empty," the instructor said, his voice carrying the weight of ritual. "Respect the quiet ones. That's the Rostova rule. Don't forget it." At Quantico, Marine officer candidates read case studies labeled Directive Alpha. Their instructors didn't give names, but the cadets already knew. In the mess halls, they whispered it like a prayer. At the Air Force Academy, cadets stood in silent reflection in front of a plaque inscribed with 6 words. "Competence doesn't need to advertise itself." The world didn't know her face. The world didn't know her name. But inside the military, Eva Rose Stova had become immortal. And she never asked for any of it. Late one night, the servers hummed with a different rhythm. Eva's fingers flew as she traced a new incursion. This wasn't the crude probing of before. It was sharper, cleaner, surgical. Lines of foreign code embedded themselves like knives into the system's periphery. She countered, layer by layer, building walls of logic, traps of misdirection. But the intruder matched her pace, move for move, like a shadow mirroring her hand. Her pulse quickened, her throat went dry. She had never met another mind like hers before. Hours stretched into dawn. Sweat gathered at her temple. Her vision blurred, but her hands never slowed. She lured the intruder into a false loop, collapsed it, and struck back with a flood of false protocols. For a heartbeat, the system was clear. And then a message appeared. Not in her system's language, not in code she had written, but in plain text. "I see you." Her breath caught, her hands froze over the keys. No breach, no collapse, just those 3 words and then silence. Her stomach turned to stone. This wasn't a random adversary. This wasn't just espionage. This was personal. And for the first time in years, Eva felt something she hated: fear. General Thorne arrived hours later, his presence filling the command cell with quiet authority. General Reed followed, her eyes sharp with calculation. They stood in front of her console, waiting for her report. Eva didn't waste words. She pulled up the log, highlighted the text, and stepped back. Neither general spoke for a long moment. The weight of those words sank into the sterile air. Finally, Reed asked, "Are you compromised?" Eva shook her head. "No breach, no damage, just a message." Thorne's jaw tightened. "But a message that means they know who you are." "Yes," Eva said softly. The room fell silent again. Thorne finally spoke. "We'll increase your security detail, double the protocols. If they want to come for you, they'll have to go through every layer we have." Eva's eyes met his. Her voice was calm, but her words carried an edge. "If they can reach me through the code, no wall you build will stop them." Thorne's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew she was right, and that terrified him more than anything. That night, Eva couldn't sleep. She sat at her bunk, staring at the broken headset on the table beside her. She picked it up, turning it slowly in her hands, tracing the dented metal with her fingers. It had become her talisman, her reminder that silence could be strength, but now she wondered if silence alone would be enough. She thought of her father again, his words about dignity. She thought of the cadets, the soldiers, the airmen who whispered her rule like scripture. She thought of Keller, looking at her with wide, fearful eyes. And for the first time, she asked herself a question she had avoided for years. What if her silence had become a cage? Above ground, the legend burned brighter than ever. In dusty barracks rooms, soldiers told the story in whispers. In classrooms, instructors recited it as doctrine. In secure chambers, generals invoked her name as a warning, a lesson, a standard. But Eva herself sat alone in the depths of a bunker, unseen, unheard, carrying the weight of a war no one else even knew was being fought. Her adversary was out there, watching, waiting, patient. And in the glow of her screens, Eva Rose Stova whispered to herself, words no one else would ever hear. They know me, but they don't understand me. Her hands returned to the keys. Her silence was no longer just a weapon, it was armor. But armor cracks, and the enemy had already found the first fracture. How much can one person hold before even silence begins to break? The attack didn't start with alarms, it started with absence. Eva noticed it before anyone else, a subtle delay in a system that had never hesitated, a heartbeat too long between keystrokes and response. To anyone else it was nothing. To her, it was everything. She froze, her eyes narrowed. She leaned closer to the screen. Then the storm hit. Monitors flared red as code cascaded like fire across every partition of Chimera. Subroutines blinked into chaos, entire command matrices collapsing under the weight of invasive logic. This wasn't probing. This wasn't testing. This was war. Technicians scrambled in distant wings of the facility, alarms echoing through reinforced corridors. But none of them could keep up. None of them understood the scale. None of them knew how close the system was to unraveling. Only Eva did. Her hands slammed against the console, her body moving before thought, fingers a blur of instinct and memory. She rerouted, recoded, rebuilt, the screen alive with her relentless precision. She was fast, but so was the enemy. Faster than before. Smarter. Every defense she built, they countered. Every trap she laid, they slipped through. It was a duel, mind against mind, the kind that left no space for error. And then it came again, the message. Still here. Her throat constricted. Her pulse hammered. This wasn't a faceless system. It was a person. Somewhere, someone was at a console just like hers, fingers flying, eyes burning, mind locked to hers. An adversary who had learned her rhythm, her style, her touch. And they weren't just trying to break Chimera. They were trying to break her. In the command cell above, General Thorne's voice cut sharp. Status. The technicians shouted chaos. Partition failures. Loss of command matrix integrity. Stabilize, Thorne barked, though even he knew his words were useless here. This wasn't a battle for soldiers. This wasn't a fight for generals. This was a war only one person could fight. He turned to Eva, his voice lower, urgent. Sergeant, can you hold? Eva didn't look up. Her eyes locked on the screen, her fingers moving faster than thought. Her voice was steady, but her words were razor-thin. Yes. The enemy pressed harder. Satellites blinked into disarray, guidance systems hiccuped, data feeds twisted into lies. Chimera strained under the assault. The servers screamed with heat, fans roaring as if the system itself were in agony. Eva fought like a surgeon working against death itself. Precision, focus, ruthless calm. But inside, something shifted. She felt the weight of years pressing against her shoulders, the endless nights, the isolation, the silence she had carried as armor. She thought of Keller, of the young faces who looked at her like myth. She thought of the generals who had saluted her, who placed the defense of nations in her hands. And she thought of the message, still here. Her adversary wasn't just attacking a system. They were attacking her existence, her identity, her silence. And she refused to let them take it. Hours passed like seconds. Sweat dripped down her temple, her vision tunneled, but her rhythm never faltered. She pulled Chimera back from the edge again and again, each rescue more desperate than the last. Finally, she realized the truth. She couldn't just defend. Defense was bleeding her dry. She had to strike. Her fingers flew in patterns no one else could follow. She built a false corridor in Chimera's framework, left a weakness so clean it gleamed like bait. She slowed her movements, deliberately letting the enemy press forward, closer, deeper. And then she snapped the trap shut. The system roared as her code slammed into theirs, binding their stream, dragging it out into the open. For the first time, Eva saw the adversary's true signature, a pattern in the code, elegant but aggressive, a reflection of her own. For a heartbeat, she felt something almost like recognition, a rival, a shadow twin, another mind like hers staring back across the void. And then gone. The link severed, the stream dissolved, silence reclaimed the system. Chimera stabilized, its partitions glowing green one by one. The alarms fell silent. The servers hummed steady again. Eva sat back, chest heaving, her hands trembling in her lap. She had won, but she knew it wasn't over. General Reed entered the cell minutes later, her heels sharp against the concrete floor. Her eyes swept the console, the screens now calm, then settled on Eva. "Status," Reed demanded. Eva's voice was soft, level. "System stabilized. Intrusion neutralized." "Neutralized," Reed pressed. Eva hesitated, her fingers curled lightly against her thighs. "For now." Reed's gaze sharpened. "You found them, didn't you?" Eva's silence was answer enough. Thorne stepped closer, his presence heavy, commanding. "Who?" Eva lifted her eyes at last. They were tired but unwavering. "Someone like me." The words struck harder than any alarm. The room stilled, Thorne's jaw flexed, Reed's lips pressed thin. The truth they had all feared but never spoken aloud now stood in the open. Eva wasn't unique anymore. And whoever had matched her was still out there. That night she sat alone in her bunk, the broken headset on her lap. She turned it slowly, tracing the dented metal with her fingers. Her father's words whispered again in memory. Dignity doesn't speak. But she wondered now if silence was enough against an adversary who had found her, who wanted her to know they were there. For the first time since that day in Chimera's control room, she felt the cracks in her armor. She had built her life on silence, on letting her actions speak louder than words, on being unseen, unheard, but undeniable. Now someone was listening, watching, waiting. And she knew the next time they came, she might not be able to stay silent. Above ground, her legend grew even brighter. In lecture halls, cadets studied her duel as a case study in cyber warfare. In dusty barracks, recruits whispered about her trap, the brilliance of luring an enemy into a corridor of her own making. They didn't know the details, but they knew the outcome. They called it Rostova's gambit. And for them, it was proof she was untouchable. But in the silence of her bunker, Eva knew better. She wasn't untouchable, she was hunted. Her adversary hadn't been beaten. They had been warned, and next time they would come harder. Eva placed the headset back on the nightstand and lay down, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Her legend was louder than ever, but inside she had never felt more fragile. The world saw strength, she felt the cracks. And in that crack of silence, a question lingered, haunting, heavy. How do you fight an enemy who knows your silence better than anyone else? What happens when silence itself is no longer enough? The next strike came without warning. Not hesitation, not probing, an assault so sudden it felt like a fist to the chest. At 3:17 hours, Chimera screamed awake in red. Every partition shuddered under invasive code. Entire command matrices blinked into chaos. Satellites staggered, drones misfired, feeds twisted into static. This wasn't just a breach attempt. This was annihilation. Eva's eyes snapped open in her bunk before the alarms even reached her ears. She was already moving. Her boots slapped the cold concrete, her headset, the broken one, clutched in her fist like a talisman. By the time she slid into her chair, the room was chaos. Technicians shouted. Generals barked into dead lines. The entire bunker pulsed with panic. But Eva, she was steady, always steady. Her fingers flew across the keys, her body leaning into the screen as though she could will it into submission. The enemy was back, faster, stronger. No hesitation this time. They had studied her, learned her rhythm, adapted. The console flashed a line of text in stark, taunting clarity. Ready now. Her jaw clenched. No words, just action. She rerouted, rebuilt, through walls of code faster than human thought should allow. But every defense fell, every trap crumbled. The adversary wasn't just mirroring her anymore. They were anticipating her. The generals stood frozen at her back, their authority meaningless here. They knew the truth. This was no longer a war of nations. It was a duel between two minds. And Eva was losing ground. Hours bled like seconds. Sweat poured down her temple, her hands trembling as they typed. She refused to stop, refused to break. The system teetered on the edge of collapse, and she dragged it back, line by line, command by command. But she knew she couldn't hold forever. And then it appeared, a corridor, a pathway carved through the system, surgical, deliberate, not her code, theirs. A trap. For her. Her adversary wasn't after Chimera anymore. They were after her mind, her logic, her very identity encoded in the system. If she followed them into the corridor, she could stop them, end it. But it would mean exposing herself completely, bleeding her entire design into the open. She would win, but she would burn herself out in the process. It was suicide. She sat frozen for half a second, her breath sharp in her chest. And then she thought of Keller, of the cadets whispering her name, of Cobb's corner left empty in reverence, of the Restova rule. She thought of her father's words. Dignity doesn't speak, but dignity acts. She pressed forward. The system howled as she dove headlong into the corridor. Her fingers blurred, code streaming faster than even she thought possible. The enemy struck back, brutal and relentless. Every exchange was a collision of brilliance, of fury, of will. For hours, they fought, two unseen architects locked in a duel no one else in the world could follow. The bunker shook with the strain, the servers groaning as if they might tear themselves apart. Eva's body screamed for rest. Her eyes burned, her chest ached, but her will held. She poured everything she was into the console, every lesson, every sacrifice, every ounce of discipline she had built in silence. And then she saw it, a flaw, a single fracture in the enemy's rhythm. She struck. Her code slammed into theirs, unraveling their architecture, collapsing their stream in on itself. The screen flared white. Silence. The system stabilized, partitions flickered green, alarms fell mute, the storm was over. Eva's hands dropped to her lap. Her chest heaved. She sat still, the glow of the screen reflecting in her exhausted eyes. She had won, but at a cost. Her own architecture, the deepest lines of Chimera's core, her fingerprints, her signature, had been left exposed in the battle. Whoever her adversary was, they had seen her, all of her. And she knew they would come again. General Thorne stepped forward, his granite face softened by something rare, sorrow. He looked down at her, the woman who had carried the defense of nations on her shoulders, and asked quietly, "What did it cost?" Eva raised the broken headset in her hand, turning it slowly in the light. Her voice was calm, steady, but low. "Everything but the system lives." Reed's sharp eyes studied her. You've left yourself vulnerable. Eva's lips curved into the faintest, bitterest smile. I was never invulnerable. You just thought I was. The words fell heavy into the silence. No one argued. In the weeks that followed, Chimera held steady. Nations stood down. Crises cooled. The world moved on, unaware of how close it had come to collapse, unaware of the duel fought in silence beneath its feet. But inside the bunker, Eva was changed. Her body still bore the exhaustion. Her eyes carried shadows. Her silence felt heavier than ever. Yet she carried it, as she always had. Above ground, her legend swelled into permanence. At West Point, her duel was taught not as myth but as curriculum. Rostova's corridor, they called it now, the act of baiting an enemy into their own trap, even at personal cost. Cadets studied it as if it were scripture. At Maxwell, the story of Cobb's Corner was paired with her final stand, a warning and an inspiration. And at every academy, in every barracks, the Rostova rule remained carved into memory. Respect the quiet ones, because you never know who you're talking to. Eva herself never heard the lectures. She never stood on a stage or wore her medals in public. She never wanted to. Her reward was the work, the quiet hum of servers, the knowledge that millions lived because of lines of code she wrote in silence, the dignity of unseen victories. One evening, Keller found her alone, staring at the broken headset again. He hesitated, then asked, "Sergeant, why do you keep it, after all this time?" Eva's eyes lingered on the dented metal, the scarred plastic. "Because it reminds me," she said softly. "That power isn't in noise, it's in restraint, in silence, in knowing when to act." She set it down, her hand lingering just a moment longer. Keller nodded, though he didn't fully understand. He didn't need to. The lesson was in her presence, her steadiness, her refusal to be shaken. Her silence spoke louder than any speech ever could. Years later, when her name was finally declassified, historians tried to frame her in words: genius, architect, savior. They wrote essays, biographies, case studies. They praised her brilliance, her discipline, her sacrifice. But the ones who had known her, the ones who had seen her at the console, remembered something else. The quiet, the stillness, the way she never raised her voice, never demanded attention, never sought validation. And yet when it mattered most, she acted. She saved lives. She averted wars. She carried the weight of nations without ever asking for recognition. Because true dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.